Everything you've been told about death is incomplete. Not necessarily false, but fundamentally miscalibrated. We have treated it like a full stop, a failure of biology, an irreversible silence. But what if death is more like a phase transition? Not unlike water turning to vapor, still present, just operating on a higher frequency. Death is not an ending. It is not a blackout. It is not a void left to blind faith or poetic guesswork. Like particles suspended in quantum uncertainty, what follows death is not absence, but superposition, a state of pure potential, waiting to be shaped by observation, by consciousness itself. Over 1,000 years ago, a sacred manuscript whispered of this idea, not in formulas, but in frequencies. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is not a text for the body, it is for the field that animates the body. It speaks to the substrate of awareness that remains when neurons cease to fire, when identity decouples from the flesh and drifts into the liminal. Long reserved for mystics, yogis, and those tuned to subtler dimensions, this guide outlines the first 49 days after death, not as mythology, but as process, as exact, in its own way, as the unfolding of space-time. A psychospiritual physics passed down not through data, but through disciplined introspection and transcendent insight. And that process begins not at the moment of death, but the moment just after. The moment when consciousness, unshackled from the central nervous system, slips into the Bardo, a realm not unlike a collapsed wave function, where all possibilities still exist until you recognize the truth. According to the text, death is not the final exhale, but the first tremor in a higher dimensional equation, a quantum threshold, where the waveform of the self either collapses into liberation or loops back into form. The cycle begins again, not from failure, but from unawareness, from misidentifying illusion as reality. Because unawareness is the true veil. It is not judgment that binds us, but cognitive inertia, the mind's refusal to recognize its own projections. Most souls, upon death, remain tethered to egoic residue, unprocessed memories, attachments, and regrets. They do not realize that the images, sounds, and sensations around them are not coming from out there. They are emerging from the quantum substrate of their own mind, like a dream dreaming itself. And by the time they realize it, the test has already begun. If the Tibetan manuscript is accurate, then the first moments after death carry more gravitational weight than an entire lifetime. This is not poetic exaggeration. It mirrors a kind of metaphysical event horizon, beyond which choices narrow and momentum builds. Everything pivots on the instant of departure. When the body falls away, reality does not cease, it expands. Like dark energy swelling the fabric of the cosmos, awareness detaches from the vessel, but not from itself. You do not vanish, you delocalize. You become an observer outside of time. Something ancient, something untouched by entropy, begins to surface. You will feel this, not as thought, but as knowing. If you've ever had an out-of-body experience where the body lies still, but something you continue to perceive, you've glimpsed the prelude. But this time, there is no cord pulling you back, no gravitational tether, and then it arrives. The light, not metaphor, not symbol, but presence, a brilliance beyond language. The Tibetans called it the clear light of reality, a flashpoint where consciousness returns to its origin. A physicist might see echoes of the zero-point field, the ocean of infinite energy from which particles arise. This light is not light as we know it. It is the source code, the radiant field in which all possible forms dissolve into unity. If you recognize this light, if you surrender without fear, you dissolve into it. You collapse the illusion of separateness. Form becomes obsolete, time dissolves, the observer becomes the field. Enlightenment is instantaneous. But this rarely happens. Why? Because fear distorts the signal. The ego, programmed by evolution to resist dissolution, recoils. Conditioned by culture, it expects judgment or darkness. It grasps, it remembers, and in grasping, it projects. The light is missed, not because it is hidden, but because the soul looks away. And then the illusions begin. Familiar voices call out, distorted like radio signals bent by a black hole. Scenes emerge not from an objective world, but from memory, belief, and desire. Temples, loved ones, gods. Every form is a hologram, observed into being. You are both creator and captive. The observer effect rules this realm. Your thoughts shape your reality. And here, most souls lose their way. Rather than moving into liberation, they fall into recognition, into the false comfort of the known. The subconscious builds scaffolding from nostalgia. Entire worlds arise from mental residue. Thought becomes matter, emotion becomes terrain, and terrain becomes gravity. The mind forgets that it is dreaming, it forgets the light, it loops. But the Tibetan texts are clear. Awareness is the only key. Like the slit in a double slit experiment, the observer determines the outcome. If the soul is lucid, if it sees through illusion, it may escape the karmic loop. If not, it returns. Reincarnation is not forced upon it, it is chosen by confusion. You are now in the Bardo, a liminal field of consciousness suspended between departure and return, between entropy and emergence. This is not a place on a map, it is more like a quantum superposition, where the soul exists in a suspended state of possibility both here and elsewhere, until observation, the soul's own awareness, collapses the experience into form. Here, time behaves strangely. No longer fixed like the hands of a clock, it stretches and contracts like space-time near a black hole. Einstein taught us that time is relative to gravity and motion. So too, in the Bardo, is time relative to emotion and attention. A second may feel infinite, a week like a passing thought. You are no longer housed in the flesh. There is no breath, no heartbeat, no speech. And yet, consciousness persists. This in itself mirrors one of science's great mysteries. We know consciousness exists, but we do not know where it comes from or where it goes. It seems tethered to the body until moments like this suggest otherwise. But here's the paradox. Most souls don't realize they've died. They remain tethered to familiar neural pathways, running loops like old data on a corrupted drive. They move through the world as if within a dream, intangible, unseen, desperately trying to reconnect with what no longer exists. The Tibetan Book of the Dead calls this realm the Bardo, a dimension of unstable reality. But in modern terms, it could be likened to a liminal state of neural decoherence, where old patterns collapse and new ones haven't yet formed. Thoughts here become matter. Emotions take shape. This echoes the observer effect in quantum mechanics. Consciousness influences reality. The very act of awareness defines the experience. Every fear, every desire, every repressed longing emerges from the subconscious, not as metaphor, but as manifested form. It's not unlike how dreams arise from brainwave fluctuations, where the mind generates symbolic worlds in deep sleep. But in the Bardo, this dream is not metaphorical. It's the very terrain you walk on. This journey spans 49 symbolic days, not measured by sunrises or sunsets, but by transformations in consciousness. Like phases of a chemical reaction, the process unfolds in stages, each catalyzing the next. And for many, this is terrifying, not because they are judged, but because they must witness themselves unfiltered. At first, there is confusion. The soul tries to return to known coordinates, the home it knew, the faces it loved. Like a lost signal bouncing through space, it hovers near the living, hoping to be felt. It lingers in familiar rooms, speaking into silence. But no one hears. No one sees. This is the first revelation of death, the rupture of feedback, no sensory echo, no recognition. And then comes the dissonance, the realization that this is not a dream. This is not a simulation. This is real, yet radically unfamiliar. But the mind, conditioned to avoid the abyss, resists. It scrambles for logic, for identity, for coherence, like a brain in sensory deprivation trying to impose order on chaos. But the Bardo gives no comfort. It is not a sanctuary. It is more like a neural reset, or the collapse of a star before it becomes a supernova, a moment of profound destabilizing transformation. The soul here is laid bare, unmasked. No narrative remains, only the raw presence of awareness reflecting itself. This is not punishment, this is initiation. A threshold science has barely begun to understand, a liminal gateway between the self we know and the self we might become. At first, the experience feels like a neutral state, even peaceful. There is no pain, no suffering, only awareness, pure and unadulterated. It is as though the soul exists in a vast expanse, a formless void, much like a particle suspended in an infinite field. Thoughts ripple outward, akin to waves propagating through the fabric of space-time, spreading through the universe without resistance. In this state, time appears to lose its grip, and the soul is untethered from the temporal world. This sense of serenity persists for a while, like a particle in a quantum superposition, where the soul's existence is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. But then, as if the quantum state collapses, something shifts. Slowly, visions begin to emerge. fractal patterns, radiant light, and figures of profound beauty. They feel like guides, compassionate beings emanating warmth and wisdom, like the cosmic consciousness shining through the cracks of the mundane world. These figures are familiar in their essence, yet unknowable, like the very forces of nature, indifferent yet profound. In that moment, the soul may perceive them as angels, gods, or enlightened masters, manifestations of higher spiritual truths. But in the language of physics, they are not external entities at all. They are simply the resonance of the soul's own higher consciousness, reflections of its deepest potential, just as light is a reflection of the underlying cosmic field. If the soul can recognize them, it can merge with them, dissolving into a state of higher awareness, a state where the illusion of individuality fades away. Here, the soul could break free of the cycle of reincarnation, akin to a particle escaping the gravitational well of its own past. But most souls, clouded by the inertia of fear and attachment, hesitate. They doubt. And hesitation is all it takes. The experience shifts and the once radiant visions begin to distort. Like quantum fluctuations spiraling out of control, the beings fade and are replaced by shadows, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The soothing voices become whispers of doubt, and what was once a paradise begins to lose its coherence. This is the Bardo's next stage, the test of illusions, where the soul's unresolved fears, regrets, and hidden guilt begin to manifest as external projections. In the language of neuroscience, these terrifying figures are not demons, but a vivid manifestation of the subconscious mind. They are not punishments. They are projections of the psyche's unresolved trauma, like repressed memories rising to the surface in a flood of emotion. Just as in the brain, neural networks that fire together wire together. These illusory figures emerge from the deepest recesses of the mind, shaping themselves into terrifying forms. The Tibetan Book of the Dead explains that what is experienced in the Bardo is not a reflection of an external judgment, but an internal confrontation. The visions are the soul's own projections, like distorted mirrors reflecting all that it has yet to face. For the soul, this is the dangerous part. The Bardo is not merely a place of transition. It is a mirror, an ever-shifting hologram of the soul's psyche, where each reflection is a reminder of what remains unhealed, what remains unprocessed. And the more the soul resists, the more the illusions take on power. Fear becomes the fuel that sustains them. The more the soul struggles, the more vivid and terrifying the illusions become, as though trapped in a feedback loop where every attempt to escape only strengthens the prison. But there is a way out, just as there is a way out of the paradoxical wave-particle duality of light. The soul's only option is to recognize the truth, that these projections are nothing more than shadows cast by its own mind, like distortions in space-time, bending reality as we perceive it. If the soul can stop resisting, if it can cease identifying with the fear and begin to recognize the illusion for what it is, the projections will dissolve. Like quantum decoherence, the moment the soul stops entangling itself with the illusion, it will collapse, and the terrifying visions will vanish, evaporating into the ether. However, few souls recognize this in time. The fear is too overwhelming and the ego too entrenched. So they run, they plead, they scream. But in the Bardo, as in the universe, there is no escape from what has already been created by the mind. The only way out is through understanding. This is the second test of the afterlife, the test of self-mastery. Can the soul see through the illusions of fear and accept them as part of itself? Or will it continue to be trapped by its own projections, caught in the web of karma? For those who fail this test, the descent into deeper realms is inevitable. The soul is drawn further into the cycle of birth and death, like a particle drawn deeper into a black hole, where escape becomes more difficult with each passing moment. The terror intensifies, and the soul's awareness becomes more fragmented. The Bardo stretches on, and the soul is pulled deeper into the gravitational pull of its own unresolved karma. By the third or fourth week in the Bardo, the soul reaches its next challenge, a full review of its past life. There is no longer any place to hide. The soul's entire life flashes before it like a neural circuit firing, each memory firing in rapid succession. Every action, every thought, every decision, the entirety of the soul's existence is laid bare. And in this moment, there is no more time for evasion. The soul must confront itself completely. There is no more denial, no more justification. In this moment, the soul faces its ultimate choice, to transcend or to be reborn. The path is clear, but the decision is not simple. There is no tribunal, no cosmic judge seated on high weighing deeds against doctrine, no divine courtroom echoing with verdicts. What unfolds next, according to the ancient Tibetan texts, is far more intimate and infinitely more profound. It is not judgment delivered to you, it is judgment through you. The Book of the Dead calls it the Great Mirror, but this is no glass. It is a total quantum feedback loop, a field of pure self-reflection, unmediated by time or ego. At first, nothing seems to happen. The illusions, the wrathful projections of the mind, the dissonant archetypes of fear and pride dissipate like static fading from a detuned signal. The soul feels momentarily free, like a particle slipping through the lattice of space-time. But this is not liberation. It is the calm before the storm. Suddenly, the system collapses inward. The self is pulled into a singularity of remembrance, not a memory, not a narrative, but a full-scale re-experiencing of everything it has ever generated. The soul, no longer housed in a brain, now becomes the total observer and participant of its entire waveform, every decision, every emotion, every unspoken thought. But more than that, it becomes the entanglement. Every life it touched, every consciousness it influenced is now experienced from within their frame of reference, simultaneously. This is not a metaphor. In neuroscience, we know the brain simulates other minds through mirror neurons. In death, this simulation becomes unbounded. The barriers between self and others collapse. The soul doesn't recall that it caused pain. It feels the pain it caused. It doesn't remember bringing joy. It becomes that joy, radiating outward through all who received it. Every heartbeat it helped, every hand it hurt. There is no story. There is only sensation, refracted infinitely through the lens of interconnected sentience. And there is no rationalization, no cortex to offer excuses, no linguistic filter to translate suffering into softer terms, just the raw data of being streamed through the pure observer. Some experience this as overwhelming peace, a harmonic convergence of love, empathy, and resonance. Others feel it as a catastrophic collapse of their emotional field, the unbearable gravity of guilt drawing them back into themselves like a black hole. But it is not punishment, it is coherence. The system is calibrating. And then comes the most astonishing revelation. This feedback loop is not only processing the past, it is configuring the future. The emotions you just relived aren't inert, they're active. They shape the energetic state of the self, like initial conditions in a chaotic system. And in that state, ripe with grief or light with forgiveness, the soul is drawn magnetically toward its next destination, not by divine decree, by resonance. This is karma seen through the lens of quantum mechanics. Cause and effect are not linear, but entangled. Thought and reality are not separate, but co-arising. If the soul is still tethered to fear, desire, or shame, it collapses into the probability well of another incarnation, another timeline, another biological host. And the heavier its charge, the lower the realm to which it is attracted, into hunger, into violence, into ignorance, into noise. But here lies the paradox. It is not being forced. It is choosing. The mind stream, conditioned by its final impressions, wants to return, whether it realizes it or not. It follows the path of least resistance, the thermodynamic flow of its own unresolved tendencies. Just as a river flows downhill, the unliberated soul flows into form. This is why the review is not merely an accounting. It is a test, a neurological and cosmological crucible. Can the soul face itself without flinching? Can it acknowledge everything and still let go? Not with denial, but with radical acceptance? That is the razor's edge between return and release. Those who pass move toward liberation, not as a reward, but as a natural outcome of reaching a state of zero entanglement. No clinging, no story, no me. Just awareness, balanced perfectly on the threshold of the infinite. Those who fail, they fall back into the well of becoming, into atoms and breath, into another loop of sensation and forgetting. This is why mystics and sages across traditions speak of preparing for death as the final art. Because when the mirror is placed before you, it does not show what you think you are. It shows what you actually are, an echo of your own causes, collapsing into their final effect. And by the fourth or fifth week in the Bardo, the illusions thin to their vanishing point. There, the final test begins. The soul is drawn toward a womb, toward warmth, toward form, toward story. But there is still a choice. The Bardo is nearing its conclusion. The illusions, those holographic phantoms of consciousness, have run their course. The soul, or perhaps more accurately, the mind stream, a continuum of awareness stitched through time, has re experienced its life as though rerunning a quantum simulation, entangled with every decision, every ripple of consequence it ever set in motion. And now, after what feels like an eternity suspended between timelines, the final threshold appears. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this is the pivotal juncture, not a door, but a singularity, a convergence point, the collapse of the wave function of the soul's potential. What happens now determines everything, not by divine command, but through a deeper law of the cosmos, the law of resonance. Here, the soul does not choose in the way we think of choice. By now, identity has begun to decay, like a memory dissolving in the neural haze between waking and sleep. The self that once thought of itself as I is now more like an echo, still reverberating through the mind field, but with no anchor. And so what pulls the soul into its next reality is not logic, not intention, but frequency, emotional resonance, neural habituation. The mind stream is drawn to what it knows, what it feels like, and what it feels like is home. No longer confronted by fearsome archetypes or apocalyptic visions, the soul sees something gentler, a mother's face, a warm kitchen, a lover's voice calling from somewhere out of frame. These are not visions in the hallucinatory sense. They are gravitational fields in the psychic fabric, karmic attractors. Just as particles in a gravitational well fall toward the center, so too does awareness collapse toward its deepest unconscious attachments. Modern neuroscience might describe this as the default mode network reasserting itself, the brain's narrative circuitry trying to reassemble a coherent self-model. But in the Bardo, there is no brain. Only habit energy is stored in the architecture of consciousness itself. And like a pendulum swinging toward the familiar, the mind stream begins to descend. The trap has been set. The teachings warn that these comforting visions are the final illusion. A test cloaked in tenderness. The soul mistakes them for salvation when in truth they are the threads of a new reality knitting themselves into form. This is how rebirth begins, not with a choice, but with a clinging. The moment attention fuses with desire, the process is instantaneous. The quantum potential collapses. The soul is reborn, not because it was sentenced, but because it was magnetized. The book calls this great unconsciousness a plunge into forgetting, a blackout of awareness like the flicker between dreams. One life ends, another begins, and the wheel turns once more. Birth, suffering, death, return. But for the rare few, for the lucid, the outcome is different. If the soul remains still, if it resists the gravitational pull of nostalgia, if it simply observes without reaching, without recoiling, something extraordinary occurs. The illusions sustained only by attention begin to disintegrate. The projections flicker, then vanish, like mirages exposed to light. The karmic web frays, the field collapses, the soul no longer orbits around form, name, and memory. This is liberation. But liberation is not a destination. It is not a place beyond the stars or a paradise hidden in another dimension. It is a shift in perspective, an escape from the simulation entirely. The Tibetan masters described it as rikpa, pure awareness, untouched by thought, unshaped by narrative. In physics, it would be like a particle realizing it is also the field, the waveform recognizing it was never separate from spacetime, that there was never a boundary to begin with. To attain this, however, requires a kind of cognitive precision that most never train for. Awareness at the moment of dissolution. A moment so subtle, so easily overwhelmed by habit and fear that it passes unnoticed. This is why, for centuries, these teachings were kept secret. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were powerful. To reveal the illusion at the moment of death is to shatter not just our beliefs about the afterlife, but our assumptions about reality itself. It challenges the very fabric of what we call the self, and dares us to see death not as an end, but as a mirror, one that shows us not what lies beyond, but what was always here. For over 1,000 years, these teachings were sealed away, not out of superstition, but out of recognition. Recognition that they hold a kind of cognitive gravity, too dense, too destabilizing for unprepared minds. Like staring into a black hole of meaning, the implications warp everything around them: morality, identity, society. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was reserved for adepts because it is not a manual of belief. It is a dismantling of the self. It doesn't offer comfort. It dismantles the scaffolding of our illusions, brick by brick. And even now, most have never encountered its ideas. There's a reason for that. If the architecture of death is not built on judgment or reward, if there is no throne, no eternal sentence, no divine gatekeeper, then everything we've been told collapses. The rituals, the dogmas, the entire celestial bureaucracy that underpins so many religious and political structures become irrelevant. If death is self-directed, if the afterlife is nothing more and nothing less than a feedback loop of consciousness, then salvation can no longer be outsourced. It cannot be purchased, preached, or enforced. It can only be realized internally. This is not just spiritually revolutionary, it's socially radioactive. Because if no one is judging you but yourself, then systems of external control lose their leverage. Fear of damnation no longer manipulates the masses. Obedience out of terror becomes obsolete, and the illusion that morality can be legislated by a cosmic overlord fades into something far more intimate and far more terrifying: radical accountability. And yet, the truly astonishing thing is that modern science is now beginning to whisper what ancient mystics shouted in secret. Reports of near-death experiences, NDEs, describe phenomena once thought purely metaphorical: the clear light, the panoramic life review, the overwhelming immersion in the consequences of one's choices. These are not relics of outdated superstition, but recurring patterns reported across cultures and continents. Neuroscience can no longer ignore this. Some researchers propose that in moments of clinical death, the brain undergoes a last surge of organized energy, a final, hyper-lucid synthesis of experience. But others suggest something more radical: that consciousness may not be produced by the brain at all, but merely channeled through it. In this model, the brain is like a radio, and death is not destruction. It's detuning from one frequency and slipping into another. This aligns with the principles of quantum physics, where particles exist in superposition, and reality itself seems observer-dependent. If consciousness is indeed non-local, as quantum theories increasingly suggest, then it is not bound by neurons, nor by time. It could survive the collapse of the body the way a wave continues after the stone has sunk. And so the boundary between mysticism and science is beginning to dissolve, not unlike the boundary between self and other in the Bardo state. What was once ridiculed as an esoteric metaphor may instead be a crude roadmap of consciousness in transition. Yet, despite this convergence of ancient insight and modern inquiry, almost no one is preparing. Because preparation requires turning inward, and society is engineered to point us outward, to the next distraction, the next purchase, the next performance. Capitalism thrives on avoidance. Social systems are built on sedation. You are encouraged to scroll, consume, perform, and forget, so that when death arrives, it blindsides you. The greatest illusion ever sold is that death is a mystery. It's not. It's a process. A psychospiritual sequence mapped with terrifying clarity by minds far more disciplined than ours. The Tibetan adepts described it not as mythology, but as cartography, a 49-day continuum governed not by external law, but by mental momentum. In their view, the afterlife is the infinite echo chamber of your own awareness, magnified beyond anything we can imagine in life. And here lies the final secret, the one no one wants to face. If you are not conscious now, you will not be conscious then. And if you are not conscious, then you will not be free. The cycle continues, not because you are condemned, but because you forget. You forgot the mirror. You forgot the choice. You forget yourself. And so rebirth is not a punishment. It is inertia. But for those who remember, for those who cultivate awareness now while they are alive, the Bardo becomes not a trap, but a threshold, a phase transition, a slingshot out of the gravitational pull of suffering. And so, if this knowledge is real, truly real, then the question is not just what happens after death. The question is far more urgent. Are we failing the test of consciousness right now? If the Tibetan Book of the Dead is right, then we are not doomed by destiny, but by design. Not divine design, but neural design. Evolution sculpted our brains to avoid thoughts of death and to prioritize survival, reproduction, and reward. In doing so, it gave us a cognitive blind spot, a refusal to confront our own impermanence. Like particles trapped in a gravitational orbit, we loop endlessly around the same fears, the same attachments, and the same mental patterns, unaware that escape requires velocity we never build. We are not unworthy, we are untrained. Look around. How many people truly contemplate their end with clarity, not as a fear of being buried, but as a truth to be integrated? Modern culture, driven by dopamine economies and algorithmic distractions, numbs us with shallow novelty. We consume, scroll, pursue, and chase, neural feedback loops engineered to hijack attention and reward craving, all while entropy ticks forward. One day, the biological scaffolding collapses, the electrochemical storm ceases, and we find ourselves stripped of illusion, but still clinging to the very patterns that conditioned our lives. And so when the body fails, the same unconscious forces persist. The fear that sends souls fleeing from wrathful visions in death is the same amygdala-driven fear that governs choices in life. The attachments that magnetize the soul back into rebirth echo the synaptic grooves we've carved by grasping money, approval, status, and stimulation. The illusions we fail to pierce after death are the same ones cast upon us now. Social constructs mistaken for truth, fleeting pleasures mistaken for peace, and identity mistaken for self. The Bardo, then, is not elsewhere. It is here. It is now. It is a quantum superposition of potential paths, collapsing not when you die, but every time you choose. Every moment of awareness or distraction, compassion or ego, presence or illusion. The realms described by the ancients may not be separate planes, but states of consciousness, psycho-emotional attractors within the vast multidimensional field of being. Your vibration, your coherence, your clarity, they determine your trajectory just as surely as momentum bends a planet's orbit or a charged particle responds to a magnetic field. If you are not lucid in life, you will not be lucid in death. That is the terrible beauty of it. The cycle is not governed by a higher power. It is governed by your own neuroplastic inertia. You create your own samsara, neuron by neuron, thought by thought, lifetime by lifetime. You are the architect of your prison and also the key. The teachings remain not as dogma, but as data. Data is mapped through introspection, meditation, psychedelic vision, and the careful witnessing of death across centuries. They speak not to religion, but to consciousness itself. They are warnings from those who became lucid inside the illusion and returned to help others do the same. Most people will never heed this. They will keep telling themselves there is time, as if awareness were a commodity that could be deferred. But time is not a linear track. It is a collapsing waveform, and death is not in the future. It is already happening. Every second, cells die, memories dissolve, and identities shift. You are already disintegrating. The question is not, what happens after death? The question is, can you wake up before the collapse completes? Because liberation doesn't come after the heartbeat stops. It begins now, in the space between distractions, in the decision to see clearly, to feel complete, to dissolve the false self before it is forcibly stripped away, to become, as the mystics and physicists alike suggest, less like a separate thing and more like a field, fluid, aware, unbound. The cycle is not unbreakable. It is just extremely well reinforced. But the moment you become aware of it, the pattern weakens, the gravitational pull loses power, the spin slows, and you begin to remember. You were never just a self. You were awareness, mistaking itself for form. So, how do we escape? The answer, terrifying in its simplicity, is this. You stop running. If death is a test, then life is the syllabus, a fractal map written in stardust and synapses, offering every clue in plain sight, yet most never learn to read it. They move through existence as though time were linear and endless, as if entropy were not quietly dismantling every cell, every star, every second. They forget that the clockwork of the cosmos has no pause button, and so they sleepwalk through life, unaware that awareness itself is the very subject they were meant to study. The Tibetan masters spoke in metaphors of mirrors and light, but today we might see it in the language of physics and the mind. The self is not a fixed entity, but a waveform, collapsing into identity only when observed. Consciousness flickers like a quantum field, ungraspable, yet undeniably present. And just as in quantum experiments, the act of observation changes the outcome. If you've lived without observing your own mind, without questioning your habits, reactions, and attachments, then when death comes, your consciousness won't be prepared to remain coherent. It will scatter, be pulled into lower frequencies of being, and recycled by its own inertia. The first principle of escape is detachment. Not asceticism, not renunciation, but the gravitational decoupling from illusion. Think of it like orbital mechanics. The heavier the mass of your attachments, desire, ego, resentment, the more energy is required to escape the pull. Every craving becomes a tether, anchoring the soul to samsara, to recurrence. But detachment is not apathy, it's mastery. A trained mind can experience the full richness of life without being owned by any of it, like light passing through glass, illuminating everything, clinging to nothing. We see this in neuroscience too. The default mode network, the brain's narrator, its story spinner, is constantly reinforcing identity, craving continuity. But under deep meditation or in near-death states, this network quiets. The self dissolves. What's left is presence, pure awareness, no longer confined by name, history, or desire. This is the space in which transformation happens, and this is what must be cultivated while alive. Because in the Bardo, there is no time to learn. The mind you've built is the mind you'll die with. The second principle is awareness. The Bardo is an illusion, but so is waking life. Our perceptions are not windows to reality, they are reconstructions, neural hallucinations shaped by bias, trauma, and culture. To mistake this filtered experience for truth is to live in a dream, and to enter death dreaming is to remain caught in its spirals. Every spiritual practice, whether mantra, meditation, or mindfulness, is a kind of neurological training, rewiring perception to see not the content of experience, but the nature of it. Just as a lucid dreamer can wake up within the dream, a lucid soul can wake up within the Bardo, but lucidity must be trained. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reshape itself, shows us this clearly. With consistent awareness, we alter our pathways. We build resilience, clarity, and stillness into the very structure of the self. And these traits do not vanish at death. They are the bridge. Because in the Bardo, there is no external reality, only mind. Your thoughts become your environment. If your life were one of grasping, fearing, and clinging, you would enter a realm shaped by those forces. But if your mind is clear, anchored in non-attachment, then even in chaos, you will not be moved. You will see through the illusions, and that stillness will become your liberation. The final principle is acceptance. Not resignation, but alignment. To resist death is to fuel it with fear, to give it shape and power it never truly had. In cosmology, black holes are not ends, they are transformations, points of infinite density where known laws break down and something new begins. Death is our personal singularity. What emerges depends entirely on the energy you carry into it. If you fear it, it becomes devouring. If you accept it, it becomes transcendent. And here lies the most subversive truth. Those who do not fear death cannot be ruled. They do not chase what cannot be kept. They are not motivated by promises or threats. They walk through life awake, grounded, and impossible to manipulate. This is why our world is engineered to distract, to make death taboo, to make stillness seem lazy, to make reflection feel selfish. Because a population prepared for death is a population free in life. And if you understand this, truly understand it, then something in you is already shifting. Awareness is lighting the edges of your mind. The veil is thinning. But none of this, none of the teachings, visions, tests, or reflections will matter unless you know the final truth, the truth that changes everything. Most people will never prepare for death. They will move through life as if anesthetized, nervous systems tuned to survival, not awareness, caught in the endless flicker of dopamine loops, scrolling through digital illusions, distracted by the noise of modern existence. The brain, a predictive engine, filters reality through models shaped by fear, habit, and attachment. And when the biological machinery winds down, when the entropic unraveling we call death begins, they are cast into the Bardo as they lived, reactive, uncentered, and blind. But here is the truth that transcends all doctrine. Death does not transform you, it reveals you. The Bardo is not a place. It is not a mythic realm suspended above the clouds. It is a field of consciousness, a quantum mirror in which the waveform of your identity collapses into pure experiential truth. What arises in that space is not judgment, but reflection, echoes of the mental architecture you've constructed over a lifetime. The peaceful lights, the wrathful illusions, the recursive life review, these are not fantasies. They are the projections of your own neurological and karmic signature, unfolding in a medium where time loses its grip and perception expands beyond the meat-bound skull. The Tibetan Book of the Dead understood this long before neuroscience caught up. Consciousness shapes reality. If your life were dominated by fear, those neural grooves would become the pathways of your death. If you cling to attachments, they will tether you to the illusion of form. If you move through existence unconsciously, death will be no different, an automatic program running in a mind untrained to wake up. But awareness changes everything. Like a lucid dreamer who knows they are dreaming, the prepared mind recognizes the Bardo not as a punishment or reward, but as a test, an entropic crucible that reveals whether you were paying attention. And that is the ancient, radical secret, hidden not only by mystics, but obscured through systems of control. A person who no longer fears death cannot be manipulated. They cannot be bought, pacified, or ruled through illusion. They no longer obey blindly because they no longer mistake survival for meaning. This is why these teachings were once forbidden, not because they were untrue, but because they were too true. When you understand that life is not the main event, but the training simulation, everything changes. Your priorities shift from acquisition to awakening, from reaction to presence. You stop clinging to your identity because you begin to see it as a temporal construct, a pattern in a sea of energy like a standing wave in the quantum field. You stop fearing loss because you recognize that nothing you ever had was yours, only borrowed by consciousness for a time. And when the nervous system begins its final shutdown, when the metabolic fires dim and the default mode network flickers out, you will not panic, you will not grasp, you will not resist, you will remain aware. And in that awareness, you will have a choice, not a choice given to you, but one arising from your own clarity, to dissolve into the field, to return to the great equilibrium, or to incarnate again, this time not out of compulsion but intention. Most will not reach this choice. They will return to their routines, let the algorithms reclaim their minds, and forget everything they've just heard. But you don't have to. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you already knows. You are not like most. You are a signal in the noise, a seeker. Because in the end, your mind is not just a passenger. It is the vehicle. It is the architect. It is the only thing that will determine what happens next. But everything you've just learned means nothing unless you understand one final truth. Consciousness is not produced by the brain. It is the fundamental fabric of reality. This is the ultimate reversal, the heretical insight buried beneath centuries of materialist dogma, that space, time, and matter emerge from consciousness, not the other way around. The body, the world, even death itself are projections in a dream field woven by awareness. What you are is not a brain trapped in a skull, but a node of the universal mind, an individuated frequency of the infinite. This is what the mystics meant when they spoke of Atman as Brahman, or the drop realizing it is the ocean. What quantum physics now hints at through non-locality, observer effects, and entanglement is what ancient seers knew in silence. The veil is thin because it is self-imposed. Death doesn't take you away from reality. It peels back your illusions about it. And so the final truth is not about what happens after death. It is about what has always been true but hidden from your waking mind. You are the source. You are the dreamer and the dreamed. And you were never truly separate from the whole. Thank you for watching. If this message resonated with you, if something deep inside stirred or remembered, know that you're not alone. You're part of a quiet wave, a rising awareness that refuses to sleepwalk through life. If you found value in this journey, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. It's not just about growing a channel, it's about amplifying a signal that reminds others they too can wake up. Stay curious, stay conscious, and above all, stay aware.